Let us now learn how to find domains of functions. So remember, the domain of a function is the set of allowed inputs. Okay. So there are only a few problems that we can find. So there are a few things to avoid. Okay, the first one is dividing by 0. Dividing by 0. The second one is when you have square roots, you don't want a square root of a negative number, Okay, and the third thing that we want to avoid is to take a logarithm of negative numbers. And here, careful, because 0 is also a no-go, okay? Actually, I wrote or, but let me say and. So in the case of the square roots, we need to avoid the negative numbers. In the case of the logarithms, we need to avoid negative numbers and 0. So let's do some examples. So let's say, let's do first a function that is the square root of x plus 1 over x minus 3. Okay, so my recommendation here, so you look at this function and you say, oh, it has two main parts, right? There is the square root and then there is the fraction. So let's treat each of those separately. So what I usually do, I draw a line for each of the domains. So now, let's say this is 0 here. So the square root of x, where is that one defined? That one is okay as long as x is positive, correct? So that over here is good. Now, if x equals 0, no problem. So 0 is included. So we draw a solid ball. And that's it. If I take a negative number, it's not going to work. So this is the domain for the square root of x. Now, let me use a different color. So for 1 over x minus 3, then I need to look at the number 3 here, right? So what happens if x is precisely 3? That's a problem because I will be dividing by 3 minus 3, 0. I can't do that. But if x is different from 3, no problem. It may be positive, it may be negative, but it's always going to be defined. So here the domain is every possible number except for x equals 3. And we represent that with an empty ball, okay? Now we look at both the two domains for the two functions, and we need to pick the values that work for both of them, okay? So what are the values that work for both? Those are the values between 0 and 3. And always keep an eye on the extremes, okay? 0 is included, you see, because it works for the square root and the fraction. So solid ball there. But 3 is not included because it works for the square root, but not for the fraction. So this is our domain, and then we write it mathematically. We say that x is bigger or equal than 0 and smaller than 3, or we can write it in the notation interval. We will learn about this later. we write it square bracket 0, 3, round bracket. The round bracket always means excluded. The square bracket always means included. Okay. Let's do one more example. So let's say f of x equals the square root of x minus 1. So in this case, I have the square root of a number, right? So I need to avoid negative numbers. So I need x minus 1 bigger or equal than 0 for the square root to work, correct? So here we have our domain. So if x minus 1 has to be bigger or equal than 0, that means that x has to be bigger or equal than 1. So the domain is x bigger or equal than 1, or the interval from 1 to infinity. And infinity, it's always an open bracket. Infinity is not a number, okay? It's a concept. Let's do one last example. Let's take f of x equals the natural logarithm of, let's say, x minus 1. Okay, so in this case, you see the logarithm, it's very similar. Okay, but in this case, the logarithm is, the difference with the square root is that the logarithm doesn't like the value 0. Okay, it's not defined. So we need x minus 1 bigger than 0 for the logarithm to work. Okay, so that means x bigger than 1. So the domain is x bigger than 1 or 1 infinity. Now I put a round bracket because the value 1 is excluded. It's not included in the domain.